In the scorched summer of 1878, a wave of death swept across Harper County, Kansas. Typhoid fever had come like a biblical plague, claiming 47 souls in less than 3 weeks. It spared no one, farmers, children, the elderly, until it reached the edge of a solitary prairie farm. That's where 4 brothers lived, and something about them was different. The locals called them the Granger brothers: Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel. They arrived in Cedar Ridge 6 years earlier, riding west from Clinton County, Ohio, with 2 covered wagons and everything they owned. They purchased 640 acres of Kansas prairie with inheritance money, set up their own farm, and vanished from town life almost entirely. While the rest of the county leaned on each other for survival, the Grangers built something all their own. From the outside, they seemed ordinary enough: quiet, polite, self-reliant. They spoke little, worked hard, and worshipped even harder. But under the surface, there was a tension about them, a kind of inward pull, like they were tuned to a frequency no one else could hear. Ezra, the oldest at 36, had a presence that made people instinctively straighten their backs when he entered a room. 6 feet tall, with icy blue eyes and hands calloused from decades of labor, he moved like a man accustomed to being obeyed, but without needing to demand it. He was rarely seen in town, but when he spoke, people listened, whether they wanted to or not. Caleb, 2 years younger, handled the farm's books and business with surgical precision. He could calculate crop yields down to the bushel, predict rainfall with uncanny accuracy, and trade cattle without blinking. His ledgers were as meticulous as scripture. No margin too narrow, no decimal left unnoted. He believed faith lived in the details. Josiah, the middle brother, had left college halfway through seminary to return to the family farm after their father's death. His room in the farmhouse was packed with over 200 books, everything from theology to human anatomy. He was both scientist and zealot, and somewhere in that collision of logic and faith, he'd carved out a world only he seemed to understand. Then there was Abel, the youngest, 25, wiry, intense. His eyes were always just a little too wide, his prayers a little too loud, his fasting a little too frequent. While his brothers studied and planned, Abel surrendered. He lived in a state of perpetual devotion that unnerved even the most devout churchgoers. Back in Ohio, they'd called him spirit-touched. Out in Kansas, they whispered other words. Unlike the townsfolk who worshipped in the modest, white-steepled Methodist church each Sunday, the Granger brothers had built their own chapel. They carved it themselves: stone walls, oak shingles, walnut pews. It stood atop a low hill on their land, like an altar watching over the prairie. Each morning at 4, the brothers gathered there for silent prayer, their silhouettes outlined by the rising sun. Each night they returned, their voices drifting across the fields in eerie harmony. And when the fever came, it skipped them. By mid-July, the illness had swept through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. A woman named Sarah Hartman, who ran the general store, was the first to fall. One morning she was stocking shelves, smiling at customers. By evening she was burning with fever and speaking in strange, guttural syllables. By midnight she was dead. Others followed. The Patterson twins, 16 and bright with promise, died within hours of each other, reciting what sounded like Latin prayers in voices not their own. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's only physician, had never seen a disease move so fast or twist its victims in such unnatural ways. Within 2 weeks, the town was gripped with terror. Families locked their doors, boiled their water, and prayed. But nothing helped, except somehow at the Granger farm. Not one brother fell ill. Not one cow sickened. Not one crop withered. And that's when the rumors started. The Grangers weren't just immune, people whispered. They were being preserved, chosen or cursed. Whatever protected them wasn't natural. And before the summer was over, that protection would become a transformation, one so profound, so grotesque, that even the state medical board would seal the case in silence, and black truth would uncover what everyone else had tried to forget. That protection, whatever it truly was, began to change. Subtly at first, too subtle for townsfolk to notice, but not for those who lived under the same roof, who prayed to the same God, who breathed in the same silence every night. It began with Ezra. He stopped sleeping, not all at once. It was gradual, a missed hour here, a skipped night there, but soon he was simply awake, always, yet not tired, not weakened. If anything, he grew sharper. His voice carried more weight, his movements more deliberate. When Caleb asked him how long it had been since he last closed his eyes, Ezra just stared through him with that frozen blue gaze and said, "I don't believe I need rest anymore." Caleb, ever the practical one, began keeping track, charting changes in behavior, appetite, even temperature. He measured Ezra's pulse one morning after prayer and found it barely there, 30 beats per minute. But Ezra was lifting lumber like it weighed nothing. And then came Josiah. On August 10th, as Cedar Ridge mourned its 29th typhoid death, Josiah rose from his chair during evening prayer and announced that he had received a message. Not in a dream, not in scripture, but from somewhere deeper. "The Lord has preserved us," he said, his voice even and calm, "but not for our own safety. He has set us apart to serve, to bear the sickness so that others may be spared." He told them what he had seen, visions of fire moving through flesh, of mouths speaking in tongues not heard in 2,000 years, of children glowing with something that wasn't of this world. He believed their immunity wasn't protection, it was invitation. Abel, eyes shining with zeal, dropped to his knees and begged to be made a vessel. Caleb remained silent, his hands clenched. Ezra just nodded, as if he'd known this was coming all along. The very next day, Josiah went to town. He arrived at the home of Thomas Fletcher, whose 8-year-old son, Timothy, was on the verge of death. Fevered, shaking, slipping between consciousness and whatever lies beyond it. Josiah stepped through the door without a word, knelt by the child's bed and placed his hands on the boy's forehead. And then he prayed. Not like a preacher, not like a man. His voice came low and strange, filled with tones that didn't belong in a human throat. He asked God not to heal the child, but to move the sickness into himself, to make the brothers suffer so the innocent wouldn't have to. The boy's fever broke within minutes. Timothy sat up, blinking, dazed but alive. Color returned to his cheeks. His mother screamed. His father dropped to his knees in tears. But Josiah didn't stay to celebrate. He stumbled from the house with his skin already flushed red, sweat running in rivulets down his spine. He walked back to the farm, speaking to no one, his breath growing shorter with each step. By sundown, he was burning with fever. The transformation had begun. Over the next 2 days, Josiah moved like a man possessed. He visited every home touched by the disease, 32 in total. At each, he laid hands on the sick, offered the same prayer of transference, and left behind a miracle. People were healed, not gradually, instantly. The town began to whisper that he was a prophet, that the Lord had sent someone holy. But back at the Granger farm, the cost was becoming visible. By August 13th, all 4 brothers were sick, except it wasn't typhoid. It was something else entirely. Ezra's skin had gone pale and nearly translucent. Caleb's arms were covered in rose-colored spots that moved on their own, forming patterns that looked like living equations. Josiah's body radiated heat, but his voice had taken on multiple harmonics, layers of sound that echoed without direction, and Abel had begun to glow, not metaphorically. His skin shimmered in the dark like candlelight seen through fog. It was no longer a matter of survival. It was a transformation in motion. And Cedar Ridge had no idea what was coming next. Dr. Samuel Morrison did. He had followed every case in town from the beginning, watched helplessly as one patient after another slipped through his fingers. But when word reached him that Josiah Granger was healing the sick with nothing but touch and prayer, he didn't rejoice like the others. He got scared. Miracles don't happen in silence, he thought. Not without cost, and never without consequence. On August 18th, under an oppressive heat that turned the prairie to parchment, Dr. Morrison rode out to the Granger farm. The path that led there was overgrown, almost forgotten. Birds flew in strange, synchronized patterns overhead. And the further he traveled, the more he noticed. Nothing here was suffering from drought. The Granger's wheat stood tall and green. The cattle were fat and calm. It was like the laws of nature had quietly bent around this single parcel of land. When Ezra opened the farmhouse door, Morrison nearly dropped his bag. The man standing before him looked like Ezra Granger. He moved like him, spoke with that same solemn gravity, but there was something fundamentally off. Ezra's skin had taken on a strange translucence, thin enough to show the veins beneath. But the blood inside them wasn't red. It shimmered, gold, luminous, pulsing in a rhythm that didn't feel random. It felt orchestrated. "We've been expecting you," Ezra said. And though the words were simple, they echoed as if the room itself was repeating them. Morrison stepped inside and found the other 3 brothers already gathered, each seated, silent, waiting. Their postures were perfectly symmetrical, like pieces of a larger structure, arranged with deliberate intention. He tried to act calm, tried to approach the situation like a doctor. He pulled out his thermometer and pressed it to Ezra's temple. It read 107.4 degrees. The man should have been seizing, comatose, or dead. But Ezra only smiled faintly, watching Morrison as if he were the one being examined. Caleb was next. His body was covered in symmetrical rose-hued spots. Only these weren't rashes. They were symbols, shapes, calculations, and they were moving. As Morrison watched, they shifted position, rearranging themselves into patterns that pulsed across his skin like equations solving themselves in real time. Josiah sat with his hands folded calmly in his lap, but his skin looked like it had been written on by invisible ink. Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Languages Morrison couldn't read, crawling over his flesh like ink guided by thought. And his voice. When he spoke, it didn't come from his mouth. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as if the house itself had chosen to speak through him. "Doctor," Josiah said, "what we're becoming can't be charted in your medical books. We are no longer men to be diagnosed. We are evidence of a transformation that has only just begun." And then there was Abel. The youngest brother had always been intense, but now he radiated something else entirely. His entire body gave off light. Not bright, not blinding, but steady, unnatural. A pale blue-white glow that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the bone. His eyes had no iris, no pupil, only light. When he blinked, it dimmed. "We no longer hunger," Abel told him, speaking softly but from everywhere at once. "We don't sleep. We draw energy from places beyond your reach." Morrison tried to remain logical, tried to find footholds in science. He asked about symptoms, about pain, about side effects, but the brothers just smiled, each in their own subtle way. They didn't believe they were sick. They believed they were chosen. Morrison left the farmhouse trembling, drenched in sweat, and unable to shake the sense that he hadn't just examined patients. He'd stood in the presence of something no longer human. The problem wasn't that they were changing. The problem was that they were still changing. And it wasn't just them anymore. That realization struck Dr. Morrison on a crisp August morning, when Sarah Preston, age 7, vanished from her family's homestead. Her parents found her 3 hours later, barefoot and smiling, standing calmly in the Granger brothers' chapel. She wasn't hurt. She wasn't confused. In fact, she seemed enlightened. "They showed me things," she told her father, her small voice unnaturally composed. "About heaven, about what comes next." Her fever began that night. Marston rushed to examine her. What he found turned his blood to ice. Sarah's temperature had climbed to 103.6. Her eyes glimmered faintly gold. And when she spoke, it wasn't in the voice of a frightened child. She spoke with clarity, purpose, and knowledge about the human body, about theology, about the structure of the soul, that no child should possess. She described dreams that weren't dreams, voices that weren't spoken, light that came not from outside her, but from within. And in those moments, Marston knew the transformation had begun to spread. It wasn't just the brothers anymore. It was contagious. By the end of that week, 4 more children were found wandering the edges of the Granger property after dark, barefoot and whispering scripture they'd never been taught. One boy, 10 years old, recited entire passages from apocryphal texts that no church in Kansas had ever printed. They didn't remember how they got there. They didn't remember coming home. But each bore the same signs. A low fever, faintly glowing eyes, and that serene, unnatural calm. The town of Cedar Ridge began to panic. Rumors spread like wildfire. Stories of children changing, of lights pulsing in the old stone chapel, of voices carried on windless nights. The Methodist Church, once welcoming of the brothers' devotion, now urged distance. Reverend Thorne, who had once called the Grangers instruments of divine mercy, now avoided speaking their names at all. Marston filed a formal request for intervention with the Kansas State Medical Board. But what he received in return was silence, or something worse than silence. 3 days after filing, 2 men arrived at his clinic. Not doctors, not clergy. They didn't give names, they only asked questions. Cold, precise questions. How long had the Grangers exhibited symptoms? How many others had they touched? Were there documents, journals, blood samples? Marston handed over everything. He never saw those men again. The next week, the state declared the matter a closed investigation. No public findings, no official statement. Whatever was happening at the Granger farm, it had been buried. But the townspeople weren't ready to let it go. On October 25th, Mayor William Harrison called a town meeting in the schoolhouse. Nearly every adult in Cedar Ridge showed up, packed shoulder to shoulder on creaking wooden benches. Some came with anger, others came with fear. All came with questions. Dr. Marston stood and told the truth. He told them the brothers were not dying. They were changing, that their bodies no longer responded to medical logic, that their presence was beginning to influence others in ways science couldn't explain, that the children who'd wandered into their chapel were not sick, but they were no longer entirely children. Some people gasped, others cried, but the loudest voices came from those who'd lost family during the epidemic. "Why them?" Jacob Steinberg shouted, his voice cracking. "Why are those 4 alive when my wife and boys are 6 feet under?" "They ain't right," someone else muttered. "Something in their eyes ain't human." A decision was made that night. A delegation would go to the farm and deliver an ultimatum. The brothers would either return to their old selves or leave Cedar Ridge forever. The committee was chosen: Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston, and Dr. Marston. They would confront the Granger brothers face to face, and if the brothers refused, well, nobody said it aloud. But there are things even faith can't forgive. The morning of November 1st broke under a sky heavy with winter's breath. Gray clouds hung low over the prairie like a ceiling pressing down on the earth itself. The wind carried no warmth, only silence. The 4 men chosen to confront the Granger brothers, Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston and Dr. Morrison, rode in solemn silence, their horses cutting a slow path through frost-covered grass. Each man wrestled with his own thoughts, his own doubts, but the fear they carried was shared. The farm came into view just after noon. From a distance, nothing looked unusual. The fields stood golden and tall, untouched by the season. The cattle grazed in perfect lines, as if guided by an unseen hand. But the closer they rode, the more the unnatural revealed itself. The crops were too tall, too perfect. The air shimmered faintly, as though heat waves rose from frozen soil. And the chapel on the hill, once a humble structure of stone and wood, now pulsed faintly with a light that made the skin crawl. When they reached the farmhouse, the door opened before they could knock. It wasn't one of the brothers who greeted them. It was Sarah Preston, 7 years old, glowing softly beneath the skin, her golden-flecked eyes locked onto her father's with a look that shattered something in him. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. "Papa," she said, her voice layered with strange harmonics. "They've been expecting you." She turned without waiting for permission and walked toward the chapel. The 4 men followed. The ground vibrated beneath their feet, not violently, but rhythmically, as though the land itself had a pulse. The sky above dimmed further, casting everything in a half-light that felt neither day nor dusk. As they approached the chapel, birds flew overhead in spirals, dozens of them turning in mathematical precision. It wasn't natural. It wasn't even beautiful. It was orchestrated. Inside, the air changed. It was warmer, charged. The brothers stood at the center of the chapel in a perfect square around the altar. Not seated, not praying, waiting. They had changed again. Ezra's eyes were now pools of molten gold, their surface swirling like storm clouds in a mirror. Caleb's skin bore no spots now, only lines, symbols, entire sentences shifting with purpose across his flesh. Josiah's voice, when he greeted them, didn't come from his mouth. It emerged from the very walls, like sound diffused through light. Abel simply glowed. "Welcome," Ezra said. But the word was spoken by all 4 at once, harmonized into a single tone that echoed without sound. "We understand why you've come," Caleb continued, stepping forward, his voice woven into Ezra's. "Your fear is natural. Change is always terrifying." Mayor Harrison stepped forward first. His voice trembled but held firm. "You must stop this. Whatever you've done, however far you've gone, it needs to end." Reverend Thorne clutched his Bible, his knuckles white. "This isn't God's work," he said. "This is something else. Something dangerous. Something wrong." Josiah smiled, not cruelly but with a pity that burned. "You mistake change for corruption. We are becoming what was always intended. You're not human anymore," Preston said through clenched teeth. "And you took my daughter." Ezra shook his head. "We didn't take her. She chose, and she is more than she ever could have been." "She's a child," Preston snapped. "She had no choice." But then Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was calm, clear. "I'm not lost," she said. "You're just afraid of what you don't understand. I still love you, Papa, but I'm not who I was. None of us are." Morrison stepped between them before anyone could speak again. "If there's no reversing this, what are you becoming?" The brothers looked at each other, and then Ezra answered. "We are the bridge between what is and what comes next, not gods, not angels, but witnesses to the threshold." And as he spoke, the chapel pulsed with light, the floor beneath them humming like the breath of something enormous awakening below. For a moment, no one moved. The chapel shimmered, its stone walls glowing faintly from within, as if the building itself had drawn breath. Light poured through the high windows, not sunlight, but something colder, something older, flickering like reflections off deep water. Morrison felt it first, a pressure in his chest, like his heart was being pulled forward. Not physically, but mentally. His thoughts stretched, fractured, and reassembled in ways he didn't understand. He was seeing things, events, people, entire lifetimes unfolding all at once. It wasn't hallucination, it was clarity. Mayor Harrison dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "What are you doing to us?" "We are not doing anything," Josiah said. "You are perceiving the veil for what it truly is. Most live their lives blind to it. You are fortunate to see." Reverend Thorne tried to speak but stumbled backward, colliding with the wall. His Bible fell from his hands. When he looked up, tears were running down his face. "I hear voices," he muttered. "Voices I haven't heard since I was a child. My father, he's calling my name." Sarah Preston stood beside Abel, her small hand gently touching the Reverend's arm. "You're seeing the memory of a soul," she said. "They're not gone. You've just forgotten how to listen." Thomas Preston, trembling, stepped forward. "This is wrong," he said. "This is not how the world works. This isn't what God intended." Ezra turned to face him fully, his golden eyes glowing brighter. "You speak as if the world is fixed, as if creation ended on the day man was formed. But what if becoming is the truest form of worship?" Preston looked at his daughter again. "You said you're not who you were. Then who are you now?" Sarah didn't answer. She only smiled. The smile of someone who had stepped beyond understanding and didn't want to return. Morrison, his hands trembling, took a single step toward the altar. "What is this?" he asked. "This place, this light, this state you're in? Is it death? Is it some stage between?" Ezra answered, but this time his voice did not carry alone. All four brothers spoke in unison, harmonized into something vast and inhuman. "We are the threshold. Our bodies, once bound by mortality, have opened. What was once illness has become ignition. We were not infected by typhoid. We were chosen through it." Josiah raised a hand, and light bent around his fingers like thread pulled taut. "Disease was the door," he said. "We stepped through. What waits on the other side is not death. It is continuity." Reverend Thorne's face contorted with conflict. "And what of God? What of Scripture? What of the soul?" "You cling to symbols," Josiah replied, "but the truth behind them burns brighter than words can hold." Suddenly, the chapel dimmed. The walls no longer pulsed. The light receded. Only the four brothers remained illuminated, their presence casting no shadows. "We will not leave Cedar Ridge," Caleb said, "because this land is part of us now. We are rooted here, as much as the wheat, as much as the stone." Mayor Harrison stood at last, pale and drenched in sweat. "Then you leave us no choice." Ezra nodded slowly. "You have the freedom to turn away, but know this. What has begun cannot be undone. We do not spread this condition. We reveal it to those who are ready." As they turned to leave the chapel, Morrison cast one final glance at the altar. There, etched into the stone, were words that hadn't been there before, written in no language he recognized, and yet, somehow, he understood every single one. Morrison didn't speak of what he read. Not that day. Not in the days that followed. The meaning embedded in those symbols had bypassed language entirely. It had nested inside him like a seed. Waiting. The delegation left the chapel in silence. Not because they had reached an agreement, but because they had seen something they could no longer explain. By the time they returned to town, word had already spread that the confrontation had failed. Families gathered at doorsteps with anxious eyes. When Thomas Preston carried his daughter home, they asked no questions. They just stared. That night, the town felt wrong. The air was too still. The wind, which had never once stopped since the beginning of the epidemic, had vanished. The wheat didn't sway, the trees didn't groan. Even the insects, once a constant chorus, had gone quiet. And then, as the sun dropped beyond the prairie, the lights returned. Not in the chapel, in the fields. 4 glowing figures stood motionless among the stalks, their outlines faint but unmistakable. Ezra, Caleb, Josiah. Abel, no torches, no footsteps, just presence. They weren't watching the town, they were watching the sky. Sarah Preston woke before dawn, sat up in bed, and began reciting passages that hadn't been written yet. Her parents wept in the hallway, unable to stop her, and she wasn't the only one. By morning, 5 other children had started speaking in patterns. Not words, not phrases. Patterns. Repeating tones that rose and fell like equations spoken aloud. And every time they spoke, birds would fly in circles over their homes. Dogs would howl, clocks would stop. The town had passed the tipping point. It was no longer a question of belief. It was survival. A group of men met in secret that night, local ranchers, fathers, widowers, those who had lost too much to simply stand by and watch. They didn't bring torches, they didn't carry signs, they brought guns. They rode out toward the Granger farm under cover of darkness, their plan unspoken but understood. They didn't intend to talk. They didn't expect resistance. They believed they were confronting 4 madmen. They didn't return. Not one of them. The next morning, all 8 horses wandered back into town, riderless. Their saddles were empty, their eyes wide with a fear no animal should carry. Marston examined each one. Not a scratch, not a drop of blood. But the horses wouldn't stop trembling, and none of them would go near the chapel hill again. No one dared retrieve the bodies, because deep down, everyone already knew there weren't any. That night, the sound returned. It began as a low hum, barely audible. But within minutes, it grew. A chorus of harmonics so complex and layered that it didn't sound like music. It sounded like geometry, like language itself had been reduced to its most primal form. The sound came from the chapel. It drifted across the prairie like fog, curling through windows, seeping under doors. Children sat up in bed and listened. Elders wept and prayed. And in his clinic, Marston sat alone, scribbling symbols on a blank sheet of paper, his eyes glowing faintly gold. Something was taking hold. Not possession, resonance. The brothers weren't spreading a disease. They were tuning the town, one soul at a time. And as the last notes faded into the night, Ezra's voice whispered through every ear in Cedar Ridge, though his lips never moved and his body never left the field. It has begun. The words came not through walls or windows, but inside the mind, settling behind the eyes like light filtered through fog. Every soul in Cedar Ridge heard it, even those who denied it, especially those who denied it. And from that moment forward, nothing felt familiar. Children spoke less and listened more, their heads tilting slightly whenever the wind shifted, as if tuning into something the rest of the world had forgotten how to hear. Old men who hadn't stepped foot outside in months began wandering toward the edge of town, toward the hills, their eyes blank and serene. Even the animals changed. Dogs that once barked at passing wagons now sat motionless at the edge of their yards, staring toward the Granger land with unblinking patience. Birds flew in shapes that mirrored sacred geometry. Horses refused to cross certain fences, trembling with some instinct deeper than fear. And through it all, the chapel stood silent, not dark, silent. Its glow had shifted from flickering pulses to a constant, steady radiance, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of stone. The brothers were rarely seen now, but everyone knew they hadn't left. They didn't need to be visible anymore. They were inside the soil, inside the sky, inside the people. Dr. Marston tried to resist it. He kept his doors locked, his windows boarded, and his mind busy. He wrote, Not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, pages and pages of symbols, diagrams, calculations. None of it made sense, but none of it was wrong. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He didn't need to anymore. On the 7th night after the men vanished, Reverend Thorne stood before his congregation and delivered a sermon that would be remembered for generations, but not for its wisdom, for its surrender. His voice, once full of righteous fury, had softened into something almost melodic. He spoke not of judgment or salvation, but of expansion, of becoming more than what the body allowed. They were never cursed, he said. They were called, and we refused to listen. Half the congregation walked out. The other half knelt where they stood and began to weep. Mayor Harrison, desperate to reassert order, called for a formal town assembly. It was scheduled for Sunday evening, one final attempt to reclaim control. But when the clock struck 7 and the meeting was set to begin, no one showed up, not one soul. The schoolhouse remained dark, the air heavy, and from the direction of the chapel, a new sound began to rise. Not a song, a signal, low, rhythmic, ancient. It wasn't something you heard, it was something you felt. Bones responded before ears did. Hearts beat in time with it. Some people collapsed in their doorways, overwhelmed by the pull. Others walked calmly into the fields, never looking back. That night, Thomas Preston entered his daughter's room and found her standing by the window, her hands clasped behind her back, like a teacher preparing to instruct a class. "They're ready now," she said without turning. "The others, they're starting to hear." Thomas didn't ask who. He didn't have to. The next morning, 5 more children were missing from their homes. They weren't lost. They had gone willingly, and every one of them was found, just before dawn, standing in a perfect circle around the chapel. Eyes closed, hands joined. Their shadows stretched in unnatural directions, longer than they should have been, curling slightly at the ends. The sun hadn't even touched the horizon yet, but they were already illuminated. And in the center of that circle stood the 4 Granger brothers, each one unchanged and yet entirely different. No longer farmers, no longer human, and not yet gods, but something in between. The circle of children stood unmoving as the first light of morning touched the prairie. Not one of them flinched when the wind returned, whistling low across the golden wheat. Their eyes were still closed, but their faces bore the expressions of ancient peace, like statues carved from something older than stone. The Granger brothers began to speak, not with mouths, but with presence. Every word they shared vibrated through the air, passing through skin and bone, etched into the marrow of every listener, whether they stood nearby or miles away. Their language had no sound, no syllables, but it could be understood by everyone who heard it. We are the echo of what comes after. The phrase settled in the minds of all who remained in Cedar Ridge. It bloomed behind the eyes like light through stained glass. Dr. Morrison wrote it down without even realizing he'd moved his hand. That same morning, 4 more households were found empty, beds undisturbed, meals untouched, doors wide open, gone, not vanished, not taken, just changed. Sheriff Lowell, who hadn't left his cabin in 3 days, finally stepped outside to investigate. What he found made his knees buckle. His wife, who had died of the fever 7 weeks earlier, stood beside the well, alive, or at least appearing so. She didn't speak. She didn't move, but she smiled, and her eyes weren't hers anymore. They glowed faintly, not golden like the Grangers, but silver, reflective, like mirrors that remembered. She turned and walked into the tall grass, vanishing without sound. The sheriff never reported it. He packed his belongings that night and rode west, leaving a note that simply read, "I have seen what comes next, and I cannot face it." By the 2nd week of November, less than 50 residents remained in Cedar Ridge, The town no longer felt like a town. It felt like a place that had already been erased, its remaining pieces just waiting to catch up to the truth. The chapel, once isolated atop its hill, had become a beacon. Not through invitation, but gravity. People were drawn to it. Even those who resisted found themselves walking the chapel road in their sleep, waking with dirt on their feet and memories of warmth that didn't belong to them. The children who had gathered around the brothers now stayed near the chapel full time. They didn't speak. They didn't age. They simply listened. At night, their whispers filled the air, not in English, not in any earthly tongue, but in harmonic waves that moved in perfect patterns. And then came the writing. All across Cedar Ridge, symbols began to appear, on windows, on barns, on tree bark and fences. No one saw who carved them, but they appeared anyway, slowly at first, then faster. Each was distinct, but somehow connected, like chapters in a book written by hands no one could see. Marston tried to resist. He really did. But on the 15th of November, he entered the chapel on his own. He walked between the pews like a man returning to a place he never left. The brothers were waiting, not to speak, not to judge, but to witness. And in that quiet glow, surrounded by symbols that pulsed softly on every surface, Marston finally asked the question he'd carried since August. What are we becoming? Caleb stepped forward, and for the first time since his transformation, he used a human voice. Not what you think, he said. Something else. Something that already exists within you. We're not changing the world. We're reminding it what it forgot. And behind him, the others nodded. The world wasn't ending. It was remembering. That phrase lingered in Marston's mind long after he left the chapel. It echoed in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats. He had walked in with questions. He walked out hollowed. But not empty. Something new filled the spaces science used to occupy. That night, he burned his journals. Every sketch, every note, every page covered in symbols that no longer needed to be deciphered. He didn't weep. He didn't tremble. He just watched the paper curl into ash and felt the strange comfort of letting go. The next morning, he disappeared. Some said they saw him walking east toward the edge of the prairie. Others claimed he vanished in the fields. But one thing was certain. He was never seen again. Cedar Ridge began to dissolve. Not in destruction, but in erosion. People drifted away like dandelion seeds, unmoored by whatever had once kept them grounded. By mid-November, only a handful of families remained. Most of them too old, too afraid, or too rooted in denial to leave. But even they could feel it. Reality had thinned. Time didn't behave the way it used to. Days stretched and folded in on themselves. Night fell without warning. People would blink and find hours had passed, or hadn't passed at all. The town clock, once sacred in its precision, now ticked backwards twice each hour. No one bothered fixing it. There was no more church, no more sheriff, no more mayor, just the hill, and the light, and the brothers. They no longer walked among the people, but they didn't need to. Their presence was imprinted into every stone, every tree, every breath of wind. Even the soil felt different beneath the feet, softer, warmer, as though it had begun to remember what it once was. One woman, Eleanor McGrady, swore she saw her dead husband standing in the wheat just before dusk. He smiled, said nothing, then slowly dissolved into a cloud of shimmering particles. She collapsed to her knees and whispered, "Thank you." She never left that spot. She never had to. In the final week of November, the sky changed. It began with a shimmer, barely perceptible. Then it deepened. Color drained from the horizon, replaced by something luminous and pale, like light remembered from a dream. The stars no longer twinkled. They pulsed. The moon disappeared altogether. And then came the sound. Not a voice, not music, a resonance. It moved through the town like breath through a hollow reed, filling every room, every lung. People stopped what they were doing. They stepped outside without knowing why, and they looked up. Above the chapel, the air itself had split. Not cracked, not torn, split, like a curtain pulled back. And beyond it, something vast, something not shaped by gravity or light or time. It didn't descend, it didn't speak. It simply revealed itself, and Cedar Ridge understood. The brothers had not transformed to escape death. They had prepared a threshold, a bridge. The sickness, the fever, the glowing eyes, the harmonic voices, it had all been part of an ancient architecture reactivating. They weren't becoming gods. They were reopening a path. And the people, they were becoming keys. That night, no one slept. Not out of fear, but anticipation. And in the chapel, the four brothers knelt around the altar for the final time. They didn't pray. They didn't speak. They simply waited as the sky began to bend. At first, the distortion was subtle, a shimmer, a warping of stars overhead. But then the horizon folded. The clouds collapsed inward like petals closing around a secret. Light no longer followed rules. It curved, it pulsed, it listened. And above the chapel, the split in the sky widened. It wasn't a rift, it wasn't an opening, it was an eye. Not one that looked down, but one that looked through. Through time, through memory, through flesh. The last remaining townspeople of Cedar Ridge gathered outside their homes, faces lifted toward that impossible aperture. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't confused. They understood. Not through logic, through alignment. Children stood hand in hand. Elders whispered ancient names they couldn't possibly know, and in the wheat fields, the symbols etched into the stalks glowed faintly. Living circuits, pulsating in rhythm with something beyond sound. Inside the chapel, the brothers stood. They were no longer four separate men. They were four aspects of one being. Ezra, the voice; Caleb, the structure; Josiah, the memory; Abel, the flame. Their bodies radiated faint energy, just enough to cast shadows on stone. But their shadows didn't follow the shape of their forms. They shifted constantly, like they were remembering other lives, other shapes. And they knew the time had come. Caleb moved first, stepping toward the altar. His fingers glided over its surface, tracing symbols that had never been carved but had always been there. They pulsed beneath his touch, lighting up in perfect succession. Josiah knelt next, placing his hands flat on the floor, whispering something not meant for human ears, an invocation or perhaps a release. Abel turned to the stained glass window behind them, which now shimmered not with colored glass, but with moving light, scenes flowing backward, visions bleeding through the pain. It showed the town, the fever, the grief, the transformation, and then it showed what came before Cedar Ridge, before Kansas, before time. Ezra faced the doorway, and beyond it, every remaining soul in the town, watching. He didn't need to speak, but he did. "Come," he said. And they did. One by one, in silence, the people of Cedar Ridge ascended the chapel hill. No one ran, no one looked back. They simply moved, and as each one stepped through the threshold, the chapel accepted them, not as visitors, as elements. Each presence added to the structure. Each soul deepened the harmony. The building wasn't just a place of worship anymore. It was becoming alive, not metaphorically, structurally. It pulsed with thought, it shimmered with breath, and the light above grew stronger. Reverend Thorne arrived last, alone, carrying the Bible he once believed held every answer. He looked up at Ezra, eyes rimmed with tears. "I was wrong," he said. Ezra touched his shoulder gently. "You were faithful," he replied. Then Thorne stepped inside. The final circuit completed, and with that, the chapel walls began to dissolve, not into dust, but into vibration, The stones faded, the glass melted into light, the pews vanished, replaced by strands of gold that wove themselves into spiral lattices, curving toward the sky. The chapel was becoming a vessel, not to leave earth, to connect it. The eye above widened further, and through it a shape began to descend. Not solid, not visible in the way light reveals things, but felt, understood. It wasn't a being. It was a memory the earth itself had tried to forget. And the Granger brothers, standing now at the center of everything, opened their arms, not to receive it, but to remember it back. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a summoning. It was recognition. The thing descending through the split in the sky had no form, but it had history. Not written in books or etched into stone, but coded into silence, into breath, into bone. It had come before, and it had been forgotten. Until now. The chapel, no longer confined by matter, vibrated with tones that passed through the town like warm currents. Those who had once been bound by flesh stood without bodies now, patterns of light, patterns of thought, each soul a thread in a tapestry too large to comprehend. And the Granger brothers, they were the loom. Ezra stood at the center of it all, his body outlined in shifting gold. His eyes no longer glowed. They reflected. Not just light, but understanding. He wasn't speaking. He was the voice. The sound moved through him like wind through reeds. Caleb knelt at the edge of the lattice, his hands weaving energy in spirals that folded in on themselves. Numbers spun beneath his palms, rearranging into symbols that collapsed into silence. Josiah hovered inches above the ground, his skin no longer skin, just script, flowing endlessly, recording every motion, every transformation, not for memory, but for continuity. And Abel stood aflame, not burning, becoming. He radiated warmth that didn't scorch, light that didn't blind. His presence bent time itself, and when he breathed, stars flickered in rhythm. Below them, Cedar Ridge disappeared, not in fire, not in collapse, but in translation. The buildings did not fall. They folded. The streets unwound like scrolls. The soil rose upward in spirals, reshaping into formations that had no purpose but remembrance. It wasn't destruction. It was decoding. And then everything paused. The split in the sky reached its widest point, and from within it a shape emerged, not above, but within everyone watching. It was not light, it was not matter, it was a question, but not one meant to be answered, one meant to be felt. What are you without your form? What is memory without a mouth to speak it? What is worship without walls? And every soul in the vessel that had once been a town answered, not with words, but with surrender, and the shape understood. A pulse followed, so massive, so deep it didn't move air or space. It moved meaning. The spiral chapel lifted from the earth, not with force, but with belonging. It floated into the sky like it had always been waiting to return. Below, the ground sealed over. The wheat fields closed, the symbols vanished, and silence fell. Real silence, the kind that speaks only when you're ready to hear it. By morning, nothing remained. No buildings, no graves, no chapel, just prairie, untouched, unmarked, as if nothing had ever stood there. But the land was warm, and on certain nights, when the wind held its breath, people passing through claimed to hear a sound carried through the grass. Not a voice, not a song, a resonance, something that pulled at memory, not personal memory, but something older, an instinct, a longing. Some turned away, unsettled. Others followed it and were never seen again. In the official records, Cedar Ridge was listed as a ghost town, one of many lost to drought, disease, and westward migration. The name faded from maps. The story faded from memory. But not completely. Because in certain places, in the quietest corners of Kansas, symbols still appear. On trees, on rocks, on the skin of children born under new moons. Symbols that hum faintly when traced, symbols that pulse with recognition, and if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of a name once whispered in awe and fear alike. Granger. But what you're hearing isn't a name, it's a key. But keys only matter when there's something waiting to be unlocked, and some doors were never meant to be closed. Years passed. The land where Cedar Ridge once stood grew wild and indifferent. Grass overtook what little remained. The wind carved away the last traces of fence posts. Coyotes reclaimed the outskirts. Trees, once planted by settlers with trembling hands, now grew twisted and thick, their bark veined with faint silver. Most people forgot the town entirely, but not everyone. Every few years, someone wandered into that quiet part of Kansas, a hiker, a hunter, a surveyor, and didn't come back. Their tracks would lead straight into the prairie, only to vanish at the edge of an invisible line. Search parties never found bodies, only warmth in the soil and symbols on the trees. By 1904, stories began to surface again. A farmer claimed to see a building in the distance while riding home under a new moon. A tall, spiraled structure made of light and moving symbols, flickering in and out of the landscape like breath on glass. He never spoke of it again, but his crops flourished for the next 20 years. Some say the Granger brothers never left. Others believe they were only the beginning. Human vessels for something older, something waiting for the world to fracture just wide enough to seep through. They weren't chosen at random. They were made, not infected, activated. And the fever, that was just the fuse. But there are darker theories. Whispers passed between folklorists and occult historians who dare study what little remains of the Granger incident. Most of them agree on one thing: the town of Cedar Ridge didn't vanish. It ascended, or perhaps inverted. Whatever happened, it didn't end. It paused. Because time isn't linear where the threshold opens. It folds, it loops, and somewhere beneath our reality, Cedar Ridge still pulses, waiting for alignment, for resonance, for the next key. And lately, the signs have returned. In 1937, a boy in Topeka was found carving spiral symbols into the walls of his bedroom. He didn't remember doing it. His parents couldn't explain where he'd seen them, but when a professor from the University of Kansas was called in, he went pale. He'd seen those same spirals carved into stone deep beneath a collapsed church near what used to be Cedar Ridge. In 1952, a woman driving across the state claimed to lose 3 hours of time on a stretch of highway that didn't exist on any map. Her radio had gone silent. The road behind her had disappeared. When she finally found herself back on a known route, her tires were covered in a golden dust that didn't match the local soil. And in 1976, a military satellite captured images of a glowing spiral pattern in the wheat fields just west of Cedar Bluff Reservoir. The report was buried. The area was sealed. But one technician kept a copy. He took his own life a month later. His suicide note was one sentence long: "The chapel is awake." And now, today, in this very moment, new symbols are emerging again, quietly, subtly, on stone, on skin, in dreams, especially in dreams. People across the country have begun reporting the same recurring nightmare of standing in a silent field, surrounded by children who speak in perfect harmony, of a chapel made of breathing light, of 4 figures glowing like embers, holding open a door made of memory. They wake up crying, or speaking languages no one recognizes, or drawing maps they've never seen. Because the truth is, Cedar Ridge was never a place. It was a signal, a preparation, and the brothers were the first to answer. But they won't be the last. That's the part no one wants to say aloud, because if Cedar Ridge was a signal and the Granger brothers were just the first to hear it, then the question isn't whether it will happen again. It's when and where. The signs aren't confined to Kansas anymore. They're showing up in places with no connection to prairie soil or frontier history. Symbols etched in subway tunnels in New York. Spirals carved into coral reefs off the coast of Florida. A radio tower in Arizona that began transmitting a harmonic tone never programmed into its systems. In each case, the pattern is the same. First comes the resonance, a hum felt before it's heard. Then the memory shifts, dreams, flashes, déjà vu. Then the people change. Not all at once, but enough to notice. It never makes the news. Too strange. Too fragmented. The kind of stories that live and die on the fringe of credibility, buried in forums and whispered through second-hand tales. But they're out there. And those who've studied Cedar Ridge, they're watching. Some believe the signal is intelligent, selective. Others believe it's ancient and blind, like gravity. Not malevolent, but inevitable. A force that can't be reasoned with or escaped. A function built into the framework of existence, waiting to be activated under the right conditions. And those conditions? They're no longer confined to time, because whatever passed through that chapel, whatever looked through that eye in the sky, wasn't bound by years or maps or species. It wasn't a god, it was a recurrence, a cycle buried deep in the code of creation, and it's not over. Far from it. In 2003, a man in rural Nebraska was hospitalized after collapsing in a cornfield. He spoke in harmonic patterns for 12 hours. His pulse matched a frequency measured once before. During the final night in Cedar Ridge, he recovered. But he wasn't the same. He left his job, disconnected from everyone, moved to a remote cabin, and every week he walks into the forest and disappears for exactly 3 hours. He's not lost. He's listening. In 2012, a documentary crew vanished while filming abandoned towns in the Midwest. Their last transmission was corrupted, just flickering light and a low rhythmic tone that caused auditory hallucinations in 3 separate technicians. The footage was destroyed, officially, but the rumor is 1 frame survived, a still shot of a wheat field with 4 glowing figures standing at its center. 1 holding a book, 1 holding fire, 1 writing symbols in the air, 1 simply watching the sky, and behind them, a shape forming in the clouds. The same shape described by survivors of the Cedar Ridge incident. The same shape traced on bedroom walls by children who've never seen a map. It's coming back. Or more accurately, it never left. It only went quiet, waiting for the world to grow loud enough to notice again. And now the hum is rising, the resonance is returning, and this time it won't be isolated. The signal that once transformed a Kansas farm town is waking up in fragments across the world. The symbols are aligning, the memories are resurfacing, and somewhere, someone is already building the next chapel. Not out of stone, but out of pattern. It won't look the same. It won't need to, because the architecture was never about wood or brick. It was about frequency, and those who can hear it will come. Not because they were told, but because something deep inside them will remember the way, and memory, once awakened, doesn't sleep again. The signal has never truly stopped. It only shifted frequencies. Now, in places far from Kansas, people are beginning to feel the stirrings beneath cities, within forests, inside dreams so vivid they leave bruises behind. These aren't coincidences. They're convergences, and in the heart of it all, the spiral returns. Not as a symbol, as a structure. A child in Oregon draws it compulsively in her notebooks. A mathematician in Prague discovers it embedded in irrational equations. A dying man in Tokyo carves it into the floor of his hospice room, repeating 1 word until his final breath. Granger. But the name is just a remnant, a fingerprint left behind by something far greater than 4 brothers. The truth is, Cedar Ridge wasn't chosen. It was prepared. Not by fate, by rhythm, by timing, by alignment. The land remembered first, then the children, then the sky and the brothers. They simply listened hard enough to follow it home. But the rest of the world, it's catching up. There are places now where the air feels thick, not with heat or moisture, but with presence. Intersections where dreams overlap, where shadows bend the wrong way, where people swear they've seen strangers glowing faintly gold before vanishing behind a turn that doesn't exist on any map. You might be standing in one right now, and if you are, you already know it. Because this story isn't a story, it's an echo. And you were never supposed to hear it unless something in you already matched its tone. Because only resonance responds to resonance, and if you've made it this far, if the names, the symbols, the silence have wrapped themselves around your thoughts, then the signal has reached you too. What happens next isn't prophecy, it's inevitability. One day, soon, someone will walk into a chapel that doesn't appear to anyone else. They'll step across a floor made of light and whisper a phrase they don't remember learning. They won't be afraid. They won't be surprised, because the transformation has already begun inside them. They were never meant to resist it, only to return to it. The chapel will not rise from the ground. It will emerge from memory, and within it, the 4 figures will be waiting. Not Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel. Not anymore. But what they became, what we all become, when we stop pretending that flesh is the end, and start remembering that we are made of pattern. And pattern, once set in motion, doesn't end. It loops, it builds, it prepares. Even now, somewhere on this planet, a frequency is growing louder. It doesn't need radios, it doesn't need voices, it only needs time, and time is folding again. You might feel it already, the stillness before sleep, the pressure behind your eyes. The moment you think someone's calling your name but no one's there. These are not accidents, these are coordinates. The chapel is waiting, the key is waking. And Cedar Ridge. It was never a town, it was always a threshold, a memory encoded into the architecture of the world, waiting for the right listener to step forward and speak the words that will open the door again. So if you hear the hum tonight, if the walls shimmer and your shadow stretches in the wrong direction, don't be afraid. You're not going mad, you're not being taken, you're being welcomed back. Because some memories don't fade, they remember you too, and they've been waiting.